It was an April morning that began with a kind of pale sunlight that seemed too shy to commit to the day. In St. Mary Mead, dew clung stubbornly to every blade of grass, and smoke rose gently from the chimneys like sighs reluctant to leave their homes. Miss Marple sat by her window with a small pot of tea and a copy of the Times, her needles clicking softly as she worked on a rather intricate pair of socks destined for the vicar's youngest. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as such mornings often are before they become history in small English villages. At 7:30, the first disturbance of the day came in the form of young Tommy Rawlins, sprinting down the lane from the post office, his bicycle rattling like a guilty conscience. He was shouting something that only reached Miss Marple's ears in fragments, words like dead and by the pond. The village, always eager for news but rarely prepared for tragedy, stirred awake with curiosity before alarm. Curtains twitched, doors creaked open, and within the hour, word had spread. Someone had been found dead near the old stone bridge beyond Gossamer Pond. It was Mrs. Hartnell who first confirmed what everyone else dared only whisper. "It's that man who was seen talking to Inspector Slack last week," she told the grocer in a tone of righteous astonishment. "One of those informants, I suppose. Always looked a bit shifty, didn't he?" The grocer nodded gravely, though his eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. By the time the police arrived, the entire high street was alive with speculation, each theory more dramatic than the last. Inspector Cray, a broad, impatient man from the county station, took charge of the scene. He had little fondness for the village's old ladies, particularly the one who often seemed to know more than his own constables. Yet when Miss Marple appeared at the periphery, neatly gloved and seemingly fragile, he found himself lowering his voice, as though she were not to be dismissed too quickly. The body lay half-submerged at the edge of the pond, a man in his late 40s, his coat pockets turned inside out, one shoe missing. A rather pitiful sight. His face was unfamiliar to most of the villagers, though Miss Marple thought she had seen him once outside the post office, pretending to read a notice while keeping his ear trained toward conversation. She remembered, too, the faint mark on his left wrist, an odd sunburn in the shape of a watch that wasn't there. As she stood quietly by the hedgerow, Miss Marple heard one constable remark that it must have been robbery. The missing shoe, the empty pockets, it all suggested a vagrant's misfortune, but the old lady's pale eyes remained on the waterline. There was no mud on the man's remaining shoe, and yet he was found near the pond. People in distress rarely think to remove their watch before drowning. And then there was that curious detail of the torn button, hanging by a single thread, a button that didn't match his coat at all. No one noticed when Miss Marple turned away from the scene. She walked back toward the village, her mind already tracing the quiet threads of human folly that bind every tragedy together. By the time she reached her garden gate, she knew this death would not be a simple one. Something about it smelled not of desperation, but of silence, of secrets carefully kept until they began to rot. Miss Marple did not rush her tea that morning, nor did she hurry to share her thoughts with anyone. Experience had long taught her that those who shout first in a murder are rarely the ones who see most clearly. She instead sat in her small garden, listening to the bees and the faint hum of village chatter that drifted over the hedges. It did not take long before a familiar figure appeared at her gate. Inspector Slack himself, looking more unsettled than she had ever seen him. He removed his hat and glanced about as if the very rose bushes might overhear him. He was not a man given to social visits. His appearance at her door could only mean that the death by the pond had reached further than the usual bounds of rural mischief. When Miss Marple invited him in, he declined the tea, pacing instead near the window. He looked older than she remembered, his sharp eyes dulled by something that might have been guilt. "You'll have heard what happened," he said at last, his voice low. "Name's Albert Crane. Used to work on the docks in Bristol before the war. Bit of a drifter after that. Lately, he'd been helping me with certain matters. His words hung uneasily in the air. He wasn't supposed to die, Miss Marple. He was supposed to meet me this morning with information. Miss Marple said nothing for a while. She merely folded her hands, her gaze gentle but piercing. And what sort of information might that have been, Inspector? Slack hesitated, then sighed, lowering his voice still further. There's been a whisper about smuggling again. Nothing large-scale, just quiet exchanges, art pieces, small antiques, things that vanish from one estate and turn up at another. I thought Albert might lead me to whoever's pulling the strings. Now he's the one lying face down in the mud. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet understanding. And you believe someone silenced him before he could talk? Slack nodded. That's the long and short of it. Then, after a pause, he looked at her almost pleadingly. I know you've got a way of seeing things others don't. I can't put it in the report, but I'd value your eye on this. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if he had finally confessed to something she had known all along. Well, Inspector, one learns much from observing the small failings of human nature. People will tell you everything if you only watch what they wish to hide. When he left, she put on her hat and took her walking stick. A modest prop, though. She had little need of it. Her route led her naturally toward Gossamer Pond, where a few curious villagers still lingered despite the constable's half-hearted warnings to go home. Among them was Mrs. Price Ridley, who seemed to think herself the custodian of every rumor worth spreading. It's dreadful, simply dreadful, she declared, her pearls trembling with every word. They say the poor man was drinking last night, probably slipped and fell. Men like that never know when to stop. Miss Marple's eyes softened in polite agreement, though she noticed the faint scuff on the wooden bridge. Fresh, splintered, as though someone's shoe had caught upon it. Too clean, too recent. And a small button lay in the grass nearby. Black, smooth, but not from the dead man's clothing. She stooped quietly, pocketing it before anyone saw. Later, as the day waned and the church bells tolled 6, Miss Marple stopped by the post office. Mrs. Weatherby, who ran the place, was sorting letters with her usual brisk precision. Terrible business, she muttered. They say the man had a letter on him, torn to bits, mind you. Police took what was left. A letter, you say? Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost idle. Mrs. Weatherby nodded. Looked like it had been written on hotel stationery. Something about meeting at the bridge. No signature, though. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the cool evening air. The lamps were being lit along the street, and the faint scent of chimney smoke returned to the sky. A letter with no name, a meeting by the bridge, and a dead informant who never made it to his appointment. Such things rarely spoke of accident. As she reached her gate once more, she took out the button and turned it in her fingers. It gleamed faintly even in the dim light, the kind used in formal uniforms rather than ordinary coats. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a person was missing one such button, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. The following morning began with mist creeping low over the meadows, wrapping the village in a thin, silvery veil that seemed to muffle even the birds. Miss Marple had slept little, her mind quietly turning over the details that others might have dismissed. The button she had found lay on her writing desk beside the small magnifying glass she kept for darning thread. Under its lens, the design revealed itself. An embossed crest, faint but unmistakable. The intertwined letters S.C. surrounded by laurel leaves. A private club, or perhaps a regiment, she thought. Both had their share of secrets. At 9:30, she decided upon a visit to the vicarage. Not for spiritual matters, though the vicar was a kindly man, but for his wife, Griselda, whose friendly chatter had a way of unveiling what the rest of the village was murmuring behind closed doors. When Miss Marple arrived, Griselda was already pouring tea, her eyes bright with the thrill of gossip wrapped in sympathy. My dear, you've heard, I'm sure. Inspector Slack's man, that poor creature. Murdered. They say it's tied to that awful business with the antiques. Colonel Denham was in this morning, quite beside himself. Apparently one of his silver snuff boxes has gone missing. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Colonel Denham, she repeated thoughtfully, a man very proud of his possessions, and rather careful with them, if I recall. Indeed, he keeps a list, would you believe? And the Colonel insists no one but his new housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, has had access. Griselda paused, eyes widening. You don't suppose— Miss Marple set down her cup with quiet precision. Crane, you say? That is the name of the poor man who died, is it not? Albert Crane. Griselda's lips parted slightly. Good heavens, I hadn't connected the two. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Most people rarely do. Family ties can be inconvenient things in small villages. They complicate loyalties. Later that afternoon, she walked toward the Denham estate. The path curved through an orchard just beginning to blossom, the petals pale as falling ash. Colonel Denham greeted her stiffly at the gate, hat in hand, suspicion lurking beneath his politeness. He was a tall man gone soft with comfort, his temper never far from the surface. Miss Marple, he said gruffly, come to offer condolences, have you? Terrible business, that man found dead, though I can't say I knew him. Miss Marple's expression remained placid. I was merely taking the air, Colonel, though I couldn't help noticing a button rather like yours near the pond. His brow furrowed. Button? What sort of button? A dark one, with initials SC embossed upon it. It struck me as rather distinctive. The Colonel's eyes flickered just for an instant, toward his sleeve before he caught himself. Never heard of such a thing, he muttered too quickly. You'll have to ask someone else. Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost apologetic. Oh, I'm sure you're right. Still, I do wonder what the S stands for. Sanborn Club, perhaps? I seem to recall your name appearing in one of their charity bulletins. The Colonel's silence said enough. When she took her leave, he remained at the gate long after she was gone, staring down the lane as if he wished he'd said less. By evening, the news had spread that Inspector Cray's men had discovered traces of another set of footprints near the pond. Small, precise, belonging most likely to a woman. Miss Marple sat once again by her window, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. A brother and sister, perhaps. A family quarrel, and a meeting arranged by letter on hotel paper. She reached for her notebook and wrote only 2 words. Denham Crane. Then, underlined once, Sanborn. Outside, a late wind rustled the ivy against the window pane. The stillness that followed seemed to hum with quiet expectation, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for what Miss Marple would uncover next. That night, the village slept beneath a moon veiled by cloud, and the only sound upon the lanes was the slow drip of rain from the eaves. Miss Marple sat by the fading glow of her fire, her notebook open before her, the faint smell of damp earth clinging to her shawl. She had spent years learning that in quiet places, truth seldom shouted. It whispered through what others failed to notice. Tonight, those whispers seemed to gather like the mist itself. The name Sanborn lingered in her mind. A private gentleman's club near Bristol, if memory served. A place with polished oak panels, discreet servants, and members who prized silence above all things. The following morning brought a reluctant son and an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Crane, the new housekeeper from Denham Hall, appeared at Miss Marple's door, looking pale and strained. Her eyes, red from weeping, darted nervously toward the road behind her before she spoke. "I shouldn't be here, ma'am," she said in a trembling voice, "but I heard you were asking about my brother." Miss Marple guided her gently inside, pouring tea as though they were to speak of weather rather than death. The woman's hands trembled so that the cup clattered against its saucer. "Albert was no saint," she went on, "but he wasn't wicked either. He took money from men who wanted to know things, where certain valuables were kept, who might pay for them quietly. He said it was only passing words, not stealing. But lately he'd been frightened. Said he'd found out something too big for the likes of him. Miss Marple listened without interruption, watching the woman's every movement. And did he say what it was he'd found? Mrs. Crane shook her head, her lips tightening. Only that it involved someone in uniform, a man who could ruin him without ever firing a shot. He said he was going to meet the man one last time. By the bridge. He meant to tell the truth to Inspector Slack, he did. A soft rustle came from the hallway, footsteps, deliberate and heavy. The door opened, and there stood Inspector Cray, his expression guarded. "I was hoping I'd find you here, Mrs. Crane," he said coolly. "You've been avoiding my questions." Miss Marple rose at once, her voice calm but firm. "Inspector, the lady came to me for comfort, not interrogation, though perhaps you might wish to hear something that may interest you. The dead man's sister mentions a uniform." Cray's jaw tightened. "We've already questioned the colonel. He insists he was at home the entire evening with 2 of his servants to confirm it." "Servants who depend upon him for their bread," Miss Marple murmured. "Such alibis are rarely impartial." She turned to Mrs. Crane. "Tell me, my dear, did your brother ever visit Denham Hall?" Mrs. Crane hesitated. "Once, about a month ago. He delivered a parcel. Said it was from a man at the Sanborn Club. The colonel gave him money to keep quiet about it." The inspector straightened. "Are you certain of that?" She nodded faintly. "He told me himself that same evening." Miss Marple's eyes met Cray's across the room. "It would seem, Inspector, that your victim was not merely an informant, but a messenger carrying something of considerable value. And perhaps someone feared what else he might carry next. His conscience." Cray's face hardened with reluctant respect. "If you're right, then we'll find proof. I'll have a look through the colonel's accounts." When they had gone, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the lane where Mrs. Crane had disappeared into the morning fog. Something still troubled her, the look in the woman's eyes, a mixture of grief and guilt too deep for simple fear. It was not only love for a brother that haunted her. It was knowledge. Miss Marple drew the curtains back slightly and stared at the empty path. Somewhere between Denham Hall and Gossamer Pond, the truth was waiting. Quiet, patient, and already watching her approach. That afternoon, the wind carried with it a restlessness that seemed to ripple through St. Mary Mead. At the post office, whispers of Colonel Denham's temper travelled faster than the letters. Miss Marple, stepping lightly along the lane with her small basket of errands, noticed the way people lowered their voices when she passed, as if they sensed she already knew more than she let on. In truth, she knew only enough to be certain that deceit had woven itself delicately between the Denham household and the pond. And deceit, Miss Marple often said, was like fine lace. It only revealed its pattern when held against the light. Inspector Slack stopped by just before dusk, his car pulling up with a weary sigh. He looked grimmer than usual, his collar unbuttoned, the edges of his voice sanded by fatigue. "We've checked the colonel's accounts," he said, standing in her doorway, "and found a withdrawal made 2 days before Crane's death. A large one, no explanation given, but that's not all. His housekeeper, the sister, left Denham Hall this morning, gone without collecting her wages." Miss Marple set aside her knitting, the rhythm of her needles stilled. "Gone? How very inconvenient. People rarely flee without reason, Inspector. It suggests not guilt necessarily, but fear." "Fear of what, do you suppose?" "Of being discovered, or of being silenced," she answered softly. "Both are rather persuasive emotions." He frowned. "We've sent a constable to the railway station. If she's trying to leave, we'll find her. And there's something else. We traced that Sanborn Club you mentioned. Exclusive lot, though they're not fond of talking to the police. Seems the colonel's been a member for 20 years. Had some trouble there during the war. disputes over funds and certain donations. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. Money changes hands far more quietly than confessions, Inspector, and yet it speaks more loudly when the dead can no longer be questioned. After he left, the house seemed to hum with silence. She poured herself a small cup of tea and looked once more at the button she had kept. Its black sheen caught the firelight faintly, the tiny crest almost proud of its secrecy. Somewhere, she felt, it had been torn, not in panic, but in struggle. A small, desperate tug in the moment truth began to surface. The following morning, her suspicion led her to Denham Hall once more. The Colonel was in his study, though his usual bluster had faded to a kind of wary defensiveness. The walls were lined with trophies and framed certificates, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and pride. "Miss Marple," he said tightly, "if you've come to accuse me of something, best do it outright. The police seem determined to ruin what's left of my reputation." "Nothing so dramatic, Colonel," she replied with calm civility. "I came only to return something that may belong to you." She placed the button on the desk between them. He looked at it, then at her, and something flickered, an involuntary tightening around the mouth. "Never seen it before." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Then I must have been mistaken. I thought it matched the uniform you wore at the Sanborn Charity Gala some years ago, the one with the laurel crest. My late cousin showed me a photograph, you see. You stood beside a painting, as I recall, a rather valuable one." The Colonel's eyes darkened. "You're very well informed, Miss Marple." "One learns by listening," she said gently. "It's remarkable what people reveal when they believe they're only being polite." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowered. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with that fellow's death, you're barking up the wrong tree. Crane came here of his own accord. I gave him money to leave my name out of whatever gossip he was peddling. That's all." "And yet he didn't leave it out," Miss Marple replied, her tone almost kind. "He told his sister he was meeting a man in uniform by the bridge. It seems he hoped for honesty where there was only desperation. A pity honesty so often costs one's life." Her words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. The Colonel's gaze wavered, just enough for her to see what she needed. The flicker of conscience, or perhaps fear of discovery. When she left, the sky had turned the color of pewter and rain began to fall in soft, patient drops. As she walked home, Miss Marple felt certain of two things: that Albert Crane had died for something he carried, and that Colonel Denham was not the only one who knew what it was. For somewhere, just beyond the edges of the truth, a second secret waited, one that had not yet been spoken aloud, but soon would be. By the next morning, the rain had turned the village lanes into narrow, glistening ribbons. Miss Marple woke early, her thoughts unsettled, as though the quiet hum of the previous night had left an echo. Something in Colonel Denham's manner troubled her deeply, not the defensiveness of a guilty man, but the weariness of someone trapped by secrets he no longer controlled. She had seen that same heaviness once before, in a maid who shielded a thief out of misguided loyalty. It was a kind of fear that bent the truth rather than broke it. When she reached the high street, the air was thick with rumor. Mrs. Hartnell was already outside the grocer's, declaring to anyone who'd listen that the police were dragging their boots. But Miss Marple had her own sense of pace. She knew that time often worked more efficiently when left to breathe. She stopped briefly to exchange a few pleasantries, then continued toward the vicarage, where Inspector Slack was waiting, looking tired but sharper than usual. "We've located Mrs. Crane," he began before she could speak. "She didn't go far, took a room under a false name at the inn in Much Benham. Claimed she wanted a few days away to collect herself, but the constable found something in her luggage." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small folded paper, slightly torn at the edges. "Recognize this. It's hotel stationery, from the Sanborn Club. The same kind that was found in pieces on her brother." Miss Marple took the note, her thin fingers smoothing the creases. The handwriting was cramped but deliberate, the message brief. Meet by the bridge at dawn. No police. Bring what you promised. There was no signature, only a small, deliberate flourish, a downward stroke, almost like the edge of a sword. Her gaze lingered there. This, she murmured, was written by someone accustomed to command, not the hesitant hand of a frightened man. Slack frowned. So, a military type, you think? Possibly. But also someone who believes their word carries authority. She looked up at him. Inspector, did you notice the ink? A faint blue-black tint. Uncommon now, but used frequently in correspondence from officers' clubs. It would seem the Sanborn Club is more deeply woven into this than either of us supposed. Slack nodded grimly. We've sent word to Bristol. If Denham's dealings there go deeper than they should, someone's bound to talk. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice was firm. They won't talk easily. Men of that sort have a code of silence, a loyalty not to truth, but to each other. That evening, as dusk crept through the hedgerows, she made her way once more to Gossamer Pond. The constables had left, the cordon removed, the place restored to its deceptive calm. The water lay still, reflecting the pale outline of clouds. She bent near, the spot where the body had been found, her sharp eyes scanning the reeds. A glint of something metallic caught the dying light, a cufflink half buried in the mud. She brushed it free. It bore the same intertwined letters as the button, SC, but this one was engraved on silver. Later, at home, she placed it beside the button and the torn paper, forming a silent trinity of truth. A club, a soldier, a secret payment, and a man silenced before he could speak. Each clue pointed not to greed, but to protection, to someone desperate to conceal an older sin. As the clock struck 9, she leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. Not murder for money, she whispered to herself. Murder for memory. And with that realization, she knew where she would go in the morning, to the one man in the village who had served under Denham during the war, and who, if pressed kindly enough, might recall what the colonel had tried so hard to forget. The morning broke with a cool, amber light that made the rooftops of St. Mary Mead glisten like polished stone. Miss Marple rose early, the thought of the cufflink resting beside her teacup weighing on her more heavily than she wished to admit. She had seen such insignia before, in old photographs and war memorial dedications. SC. Sanborn Club, yes, but also Special Commission, an informal wartime circle of officers whose duties had often blurred the line between honor and necessity. Colonel Denham had served then, and so had one other man who still lived quietly at the edge of the village, Sergeant Harold Finch. By mid-morning she was walking up the narrow path that led to his cottage, her steps steady, her purpose clear. Finch was in his garden, trimming roses with the care of a man who preferred flowers to people. His back stiffened slightly when he saw her, though his manner remained polite. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Fine weather for gardening, though the soil's still heavy from all that rain." "Indeed," she said kindly, "but sometimes things grow best when the earth has been properly stirred. You served with Colonel Denham once, did you not?" The shears paused mid-air. "That was a long time ago." "I dare say," she continued gently, "but long ago things have a way of finding their way back to the present, especially when one has not truly buried them." Finch exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the roses. "If you're asking about the war, I don't talk about it. Nothing worth remembering." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied softly. "Everything worth forgetting often holds the truth about what happens next." She set the silver cufflink on the garden wall between them. "This was found at Gossamer Pond, near where poor Albert Crane was killed." His hand trembled slightly. "I've never been near that pond." "Of course not," she said mildly. "Though it is curious. Your name appeared once, years ago, in a local article about a veterans' reunion at the Sanborn Club. There was even a photograph. You and the Colonel, side by side, wearing these very same cufflinks. For a moment, all sound seemed to fade. The soft wind, the distant chatter of birds, and only the small, sharp click of his shears breaking a stem remained. Then he looked at her, and the guarded pride in his eyes collapsed into weariness. "It wasn't meant to happen like that," he said at last, his voice rough. "Albert came to me, not the Colonel. Said he had proof of something, letters, reports from the old days that could ruin Denham's standing. I warned him to stay out of it, but he said he'd already taken money to deliver them elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" He nodded. He was supposed to hand them to a man from London, someone who wanted them for the papers. But when Denham found out, he begged me to stop him, to talk him down. I met Albert by the bridge. Tried to reason with him, I swear it. He shoved me, I shoved back. He slipped, struck his head on the stones. I panicked. His voice dropped to a whisper. I thought if I made it look like robbery, it would end there. Denham never wanted blood. He just wanted the past buried. Miss Marple's eyes were soft but unyielding. "And yet the past has an inconvenient habit of unearthing itself, Mr. Finch, especially when good men make bad promises." He bowed his head, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. "What will you do?" She said quietly. "Nothing. But the truth, once spoken aloud, tends to find its own path to justice. Inspector Slack will be calling again soon, I imagine. It would be best if you told him before he finds out from someone else." As she walked back down the lane, the sun had already begun to fade behind a pale veil of cloud. She felt no triumph, only the quiet ache that always followed the solving of a crime born not of malice, but of frailty. Behind her, a single rose petal drifted from Finch's garden, catching the wind like a whisper from another time. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the afternoon had surrendered to a dull, grey quiet. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, and she moved through her sitting room with the habitual gentleness of someone who had seen too many endings. She did not need to rush to the telephone. She knew Harold Finch would go to the authorities before the day's end. Men like him, men who had carried guilt in silence, always confessed once they were given permission to speak. Still, something in her heart resisted the easy finality of his words. Accidents were rarely so tidy. At dusk, Inspector Slack appeared at her gate, his coat speckled with the first drops of rain. He looked both relieved and unsettled, as if the day's conclusion had come too easily. "We have Finch in custody," he began, standing on her porch with his hat in hand. "He came straight to us. Says it was an accident, just like you said it. Would be. Denham corroborates his story, admits he asked Finch to dissuade the victim, but swears he never ordered harm." Miss Marple offered him a seat and poured him tea. "And you believe him?" Slack hesitated. "I want to. Finch seems broken up about it. The Colonel's been cooperative. There's motive enough to explain it all, fear of scandal, wartime secrets. But something about it doesn't sit right." The coroner's report came back. Fracture to the back of the skull, not consistent with a single fall. 2 blows, one sharp, one dull. Her knitting needles lay untouched on the table. "Ah," she murmured. "Then we must assume there were 2 moments of decision that night, not one." He frowned. "You think Finch is lying?" "No," she said softly. "I think Finch told the truth as far as he could bear it, but guilt is a fog. It often obscures what stands behind it. Tell me, Inspector, was anything missing from the Colonel's study after all?" Slack looked up sharply. "Yes, now that you mention it. A small box, locked, supposedly containing correspondence from his service days. Denham claims he destroyed it years ago, but his housekeeper insists she dusted it only last week." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze far away. "And who, I wonder, would have had reason to ensure those letters never came to light? Not Finch, certainly. He was a loyal man, and loyalty seldom kills twice." She rose then, moving to the window where the last light of evening bled through the lace curtains. Do you recall, Inspector, that Mrs. Crane vanished briefly before you found her? Fear, yes. But fear of what? Not of the police, surely. She came to me after she ran. She wanted help, though she couldn't quite ask for it. I believe she was protecting someone still. Slack's voice lowered. You think the sister was involved? Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression unreadable. Not directly, but perhaps she hid something or someone. I've known too many families bound by guilt to mistake the look in her eyes. There was shame, yes, but not her own. The kind that comes from keeping another's sin alive. The inspector rose, tightening his coat. Where should I start? The pond, she said simply. One last time. If my suspicions are right, you'll find not what was thrown in, but what was never meant to stay hidden. When he left, the rain had begun in earnest, steady and whispering, the kind that deepened the silence rather than broke it. Miss Marple stood alone by the fire, listening to the rhythmic tapping on her window pane. Outside, the world was washing itself clean, but she knew too well that human conscience never truly followed suit. By the time the clock struck 9, a knock echoed faintly through the house. She opened the door to find Inspector Slack again, soaked to the bone but wide-eyed, holding something wrapped in his handkerchief, a tarnished silver box, its lock broken, clean. It was buried in the mud beneath the bridge, he said, his voice low. Inside were letters, signed and dated. Not from the Colonel, Miss Marple, from Mrs. Crane. She met his gaze quietly. Then I'm afraid the accident was no accident at all. Inspector Slack laid the silver box carefully on Miss Marple's table, the cloth beneath it already darkened by rain. The old lady leaned closer, her fingers hovering just above the tarnished metal, as though she were afraid to disturb something that had slept too long. The air between them seemed to thicken, the faint hiss of the fireplace the only sound. When at last she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Letters from Mrs. Crane, you said?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on the box as if it might still move. 7 of them, all addressed to Colonel Denham, the earliest from 1944, the last dated barely 3 weeks ago. They were personal, very personal. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Then it seems the good Colonel's entanglements were not only political. Exactly. She wasn't his housekeeper back then. She was his nurse, after his injury in France. They grew close, by the looks of it. But she was already married. Her husband found out and threatened to expose Denham to his superiors. There's even a note in here, from Denham to Finch, asking him to handle the matter discreetly. The husband died not long after. A boating accident, officially. Slack exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. And now her brother turns up dead the same way. 2 accidents, both inconveniently placed. Miss Marple took her time before answering. The past does enjoy repetition, Inspector, but it rarely does so by coincidence. He frowned. So you think Denham killed them both? Not quite, she murmured. Men like Denham don't dirty their own hands twice. The first death may have been his doing, or at least his command, but the second, that smells of protection, not ambition. And protection is a woman's crime. Slack stared at her. Mrs. Crane? Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. Oh no, not directly. But affection makes accomplices of us all. If she learned her brother was blackmailing the Colonel with those same old letters, she might have warned someone. Perhaps begged Finch to intervene again, just as before. Only this time, Finch wasn't alone by the bridge. The inspector's jaw tightened. You mean Denham was there too? She shook her head gently. No. I think Mrs. Crane herself followed them, out of fear, out of desperation. When the quarrel turned violent, she struck, not to kill perhaps, but to silence. The second blow, the one from behind, that was hers. I imagine she fled before she even realized what she'd done. and afterward, guilt drove her to bury the very letters that had caused it all. Slack paced a moment, silent but restless. It fits. The letters explain the motive. The second wound explains the death. But how do we prove it? You need not, Miss Marple said softly. She already has. Her handwriting betrayed her twice. Once in love, and again in fear. The torn note found on her brother was written by the same hand as these letters. She lured him there, not Denham. The bridge was her meeting, not his. The inspector looked down at the small pile of paper, his expression heavy. Good Lord, she's confessed without knowing it. Miss Marple's voice held no triumph. Confession takes many forms, Inspector. Some come before the words are ever spoken. He glanced toward the window where rain pressed softly against the glass. She's still at the inn in Much Benham. I'll have to bring her in tonight. As he turned to go, Miss Marple laid a hand on his sleeve. Be kind, won't you? There is a cruelty in truth when it arrives too late for forgiveness. He hesitated, then nodded and left, his footsteps fading into the rain. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained still for a long while. She touched the edge of one letter, her face unreadable. Outside, the wind rose through the hedges like a sigh from the past, a sound of something ending and something remembered. She whispered, almost to herself, love and guilt, they never truly die. They only change their disguises. Then she folded her hands neatly in her lap, listening as the church clock struck 10, each toll echoing the quiet certainty that justice, in its slow and human way, was finally on its way to St. Mary Mead. It was nearing midnight when the telephone rang, a sharp, solitary sound that startled the stillness of Miss Marple's cottage. She rose at once, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, and lifted the receiver with that calm, deliberate grace that never faltered, even in moments such as these. Miss Marple. Inspector Slack's voice was quieter than usual, strained at the edges. It's done. Mrs. Crane came willingly. She didn't deny it. Said she'd only meant to stop the quarrel. Thought her brother would ruin everything. Denham, the letters, her life. She struck him once, she said, just to make him let go. But when she saw the blood, she ran. I think she's been waiting ever since for someone to ask her to tell it. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. And Colonel Denham, he's denying nothing either. Claims he'd long suspected Finch might take matters into his own hands, but he swears he never meant for harm to come of it. He looked more like a man relieved than disgraced. The press won't get far. We'll keep it quiet. There was a pause, a long one, heavy with the soft hum of the line. Then Slack said, more quietly, It's strange, isn't it? All this over a few old letters. You'd think time would dull things like that. Miss Marple smiled faintly into the receiver. Time softens the surface, Inspector, but it rarely reaches what lies beneath. People carry their hearts in the past far longer than they admit. The war ended, but for some, the battle never did. He sighed. You'll make a philosopher of me yet. I should hope not, she said mildly. Philosophers think too much and observe too little. Good night, Inspector. When the line went dead, she stood for a moment beside the small table where the silver box still rested. It seemed smaller now, less ominous, almost pitiful in its stillness. She traced one finger over the faded crest, her thoughts distant. There had been a time when such emblems meant honor and duty. Now they seemed little more than symbols of human frailty disguised as pride. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a restless quiet, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. She stepped to the window and looked out across the village. Lamps flickered faintly in a few windows. The world was resettling itself after another tragedy, as it always did. Tomorrow, the grocer's wife would remark on how shocking it all was, and Mrs. Hartnell would claim she'd suspected as much from the beginning. Life, Miss Marple thought, had an admirable ability to return to its pattern, no matter how deeply it had been disturbed. She turned back toward the fire, which was burning low but steady. In the dim glow, her knitting lay where she'd left it, a soft tangle of half-formed stitches. She took it up again, more from habit than intention, her hands moving slowly, her thoughts quiet but unyielding. There would be a funeral soon, perhaps two. There would be forgiveness where it was not deserved, and silence where truth should have been spoken. And through it all, she would watch, as she always did, not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet tenderness for the strange and sorrowful ways in which people tried, and failed, to live honestly. When at last the clock struck 1, Miss Marple set down her knitting and extinguished the lamp. The silver box still gleamed faintly in the moonlight, like a relic from another life. She looked at it one last time and murmured, "Justice, perhaps, but never peace." Then she drew the curtains, leaving the night to keep its own secrets. The village would sleep soundly, but for Miss Marple, the truth, once seen, was never entirely forgotten. The following morning brought a washed clarity to the village, as though the rain had scrubbed the streets clean of rumor and guilt alike. Yet for Miss Marple, the air felt heavier than before. She had learned long ago that truth, once uncovered, did not vanish, it merely settled, like dust upon the lives it had disturbed. She sat by the hearth, her tea cooling beside her, and watched the smoke curl slowly upward. Outside, the church bell tolled faintly for morning service, its notes carrying through the mist with a subdued melancholy. A soft knock came at the door. When she opened it, Inspector Slack stood there, not in his usual brisk manner, but with an odd quietness about him. His hat was in his hand, his eyes tired yet searching, as though he had come not to report, but to understand. "May I come in?" he asked. She gestured him toward the chair by the fire, the same one he had sat in many times before. He remained standing for a moment, glancing at the silver box still resting on the table, now empty and dull in the pale light. "She's gone," he said finally. "Mrs. Crane. We kept her at the station overnight. She asked to write a letter this morning, then took something from her sleeve before anyone noticed. By the time they reached her, it was too late." Miss Marple's hand stilled upon her teacup. "Poison?" He nodded. "A small vial. We think she'd carried it since the night of the murder. Perhaps she meant it for herself all along. There was a note, short. She thanked us for making it clear, and asked that her brother be buried near her husband." The silence that followed seemed to draw the warmth from the room. Miss Marple looked into the fire, where a single log crumbled into ash. "Guilt is a persistent companion, Inspector. It waits patiently, even when the law has finished its work." Slack lowered himself into the chair, staring into the flames. "I can't help thinking we should have seen it coming. She didn't look like a murderer, you know. Just tired. Like someone who'd been waiting too long for permission to rest." Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. "That's often what the end looks like. Not wickedness, not cruelty, just exhaustion. A life built on concealment collapses under its own silence." He sighed and rubbed his eyes. "The Colonel's leaving St. Mary Mead. Says he can't stay after this. I suppose I don't blame him." "No," she said quietly. "Some people must travel to escape the echo of what they've done. But one cannot truly leave the sound of one's own conscience." For a while, neither spoke. The ticking of the clock grew loud in the stillness. Then Slack stood, straightening his coat. "You were right from the beginning, Miss Marple. Every time it seems you see something I don't." She smiled faintly. "I see only what people try too hard to hide, Inspector, and one cannot hide human weakness. It's the most visible thing in the world." He managed a weary smile, tipped his hat, and left. The door closed softly behind him, and the quiet of the house returned, gentle but absolute. Miss Marple rose, moved to the window, and looked out across the village green where the first children of the day were beginning to play, their laughter cutting through the cold air with a fragile brightness. Life, she thought, was merciful that way. It continued, heedless of sorrow. She turned back to the table and picked up the empty silver box, weighing it in her palm for a moment before opening the drawer of her writing desk. She placed it carefully inside, next to a small collection of keepsakes, tokens from other cases, other human failings that had once worn disguises of respectability. Closing the drawer, she allowed herself a long, quiet breath. There would be other mysteries, other sorrows that wound their way into the calm fabric of village life, but for now, the rain had ceased, and the world was, for a moment, still. Outside, a robin sang in the ivy, bright and insistent, as if to remind her that even after tragedy, some small things had the grace to begin again. The morning after Mrs. Crane's death came with a subdued quietness that settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy shawl. The villagers moved about their routines with lowered voices, as though afraid to disturb the air. Even the postman, usually brisk with gossip, delivered his letters in near silence. Miss Marple observed it all from her garden gate, her expression unreadable beneath the soft brim of her hat. She knew the village well enough to understand that this hush would not last. Mourning in St. Mary Mead always gave way to speculation, and speculation was rarely kind. She had just turned toward her front path when the vicar's wife appeared, hurrying up the lane with her shawl drawn tight. Griselda looked pale, her usual cheerful chatter subdued. "Oh, Jane," she said breathlessly. "Have you heard? They found something else. Behind the inn where Mrs. Crane was staying. The constable said it was hidden in the floorboards." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "Something else?" "A key," Griselda whispered. "A safe deposit key, marked with the name of a bank in Bath. Inspector Slack came round not an hour ago. He's gone there himself to see what it unlocks. He says it may explain why Mrs. Crane never tried to run further." Miss Marple thanked her quietly and watched as the vicar's wife disappeared up the road, her words trailing off like the end of a hymn. A safe deposit key. That was not the gesture of a woman consumed by guilt. It was the act of someone who still wished for control, even in the face of ruin. Whatever Mrs. Crane had hidden in that box, it was not merely confession. It was legacy. By late afternoon, Inspector Slack returned, looking older than he had the day before. He entered without ceremony, removing his hat and sitting heavily by the window. "You were right again," he said. "There were more letters in the deposit box. But not to Denham. These were addressed to her daughter. Seems she had one, grown now, living in London under another name. She meant for the girl to inherit her savings and the truth if anything ever happened to her. Only one problem. The daughter doesn't exist." Miss Marple's brows drew together ever so slightly. "Not exist? She died in infancy, according to parish records. The child was buried here, 20 years ago." The faintest shadow crossed her expression. "Then someone else was meant to receive those letters." He nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. There's no child, but there is a name, Anne Crane. I checked. It against hotel registries. There's been an Anne Crane staying at the Bath Hotel these past 3 months, registered under a false address." Miss Marple's eyes grew distant, the pattern forming quietly in her mind. So the letters weren't meant for a daughter. They were meant for a replacement. Someone she trusted to carry what she could no longer bear. A woman who could move freely where she could not. Slack leaned forward. "If you're right, that means there's another piece of this still missing. Someone who knows everything and is still out there." Miss Marple rose, moving to the mantelpiece where a small photograph stood among her porcelain ornaments. It was of St. Mary Mead's fate from years ago, the kind where every villager's face, smiling and unguarded, had been caught by chance. Her gaze lingered on one figure near the edge, a woman holding a child, half turned toward the camera, her expression soft but secretive. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you must ask Colonel Denham whether he remembers a nurse by the name of Margaret Fell. She worked at the same hospital as Mrs. Crane during the war. If my memory serves, they were inseparable." Slack blinked. "Fell? That name doesn't appear anywhere in the file." "No," Miss Marple murmured. "But that's precisely why she matters. Mrs. Crane trusted her with something before all this began. I think perhaps Margaret Fell became Anne Crane, and if so, she now holds the last truth neither the Colonel nor Mrs. Crane dared to speak." Slack stood, the determination returning to his posture. "I'll find her." Miss Marple nodded once, though her eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "Do. But tread carefully, Inspector. A woman who has lived this long in another's shadow may not surrender her secrets willingly. And secrets like these," she added softly, "have a way of taking one more life before they rest." The room fell silent again, save for the ticking clock and the faint murmur of rain beyond the glass. Steady, patient, and knowing, as though time itself waited for the last loose thread to be drawn. The next day dawned cold and thin, the kind of pale English morning that seemed to whisper its secrets rather than speak them aloud. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual, though she had hardly slept. Her mind lingered on the name Margaret Fell, a shadow drifting across memories of the war years, the hospital wards, and the soft voices of nurses who carried more burdens than medals. She remembered a woman with steady hands and watchful eyes, someone who had once attended a convalescent service in the parish. Self-contained, modest, but with that peculiar air of quiet purpose that made one wonder what she was not saying. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack returned, his expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and grim satisfaction. He removed his hat with an unusual deference before speaking. "We've found her, Margaret Fell, or rather, Anne Crane, as she's been calling herself. She's been living under that name since 1946. I wired Bath first thing and had them hold her for questioning." Miss Marple poured him tea and waited, her silence drawing out the rest. "She didn't deny it," he went on. "Said she'd taken the name to protect Mrs. Crane, claimed they were like sisters during the war. When the letters began again, she said she only kept them safe, that she was trying to finish what was left undone. I asked her what that meant, but she shut down after that. Said some promises aren't meant to be explained." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, the spoon making slow, deliberate circles. "And yet she allowed the inspector to find her," she said softly. "That tells us she's ready for something to end, even if she cannot quite face what must begin." Slack leaned forward. "I think she knows more than she admits. There's a tone to her voice, like someone who's seen the whole picture but won't paint it in." Miss Marple's gaze was distant. "It's the tone of someone who has loved all the wrong people, Inspector, and found herself bound to their consequences." He exhaled heavily. "There's something else. The Bath authorities found a trunk in her room. Inside, an old uniform, nurse's insignia, a bundle of photographs, and one last letter. It was sealed. Addressed to you?" He placed it on the table between them, the paper thin and brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before opening it. The scent of faded lavender rose faintly as she unfolded the page. "My dear Miss Marple, if this reaches you, it means the story has finally caught up with itself. You once told me, long ago, that truth has patience. I did not believe you then. I do now. There were things we could not confess in 1944. Men who ordered what conscience would not. Women who obeyed because silence seemed the kinder sin. Mrs. Crane and I did what we thought spared lives, but we only postponed the ruin. Denham's reports, the ones Albert carried, were not political. They were personal. He was not covering for corruption. He was covering for mercy. During the war, Denham falsified casualty records to protect a handful of wounded deserters from execution. It was a crime by law, but an act of humanity by heart. The records vanished with the end of the war, until Albert found fragments among the club's archives and sought to profit from them. I could not let the world unbury that kindness, only to call it betrayal. So I took the letters, hid the proof, and kept the silence he paid for in guilt. When Mrs. Crane faltered, I took her name. She protected his heart. I protected his memory. If you read this, you will understand that the truth must die with us. Some legacies do better in the dark. Miss Marple lowered the letter slowly, the faint rustle of paper seeming to echo in the quiet room. The inspector was watching her closely, though he said nothing. After a long pause, she folded the page neatly, smoothing its creases. "You will file this away, Inspector," she said softly. "It proves nothing, condemns no one, and redeems those already gone. It belongs not in evidence, but in peace." Slack hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose there's justice, and then there's mercy. You've always preferred the latter." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes were clouded with thought. "Justice is often a creature of men, Inspector. Mercy belongs to God. And between them," she said, rising to place the letter in the fire, "there is the quiet work of women." The paper curled and blackened in the flames, the ink dissolving into smoke that drifted upward like a final unspoken prayer. Outside, the sun broke through the thinning mist, its light falling gently across the garden path, where the first crocus of spring had begun to bloom. Miss Marple watched until the last trace of the letter was gone. Only then did she turn away, whispering under her breath, "Yes, some legacies do better in the dark." And for the first time in many days, she smiled. Not from triumph, but from the rare, fragile peace of knowing that even in the tangle of lies, something good had once been hidden there all along.